Hello. It is Monday, somewhere towards the end of August. I'm not entirely sure what the date is today. But hello, my name's Phil, and it is my delight this week to be reading with you through the Old Testament book of Lamentations. Now, listen, we love the Bible, don't we? We trust the Bible. We believe the Bible is God's word and it is all wonderful and it's a precious gift to us, of course. But a little heads up before we dive into Lamentations. You are probably not going to come out of this week feeling inspired, motivated, or uplifted, because Lamentations is a book, to be honest, that is pretty bleak in its outlook. It's a book that has been written by, well, we're not entirely sure who wrote it. Most people think Jeremiah did, and that is a, fair enough suggestion. But within the book of Lamentations, Jeremiah, or whoever it was who wrote it, is processing a lot of pain. He's processing an event, a season in the life of God's people that was probably its darkest season of its history. It would be useful to know the backdrop to the book of Lamentations. So I just want to encourage you, if you're not sure of the backdrop, go away now and read 2 Kings chapter 24 and 25. And read Jeremiah chapter 52. That will help you understand the context within which this book has been written. But essentially the backdrop is Jerusalem, the holy city, the city that in other parts of the Bible, and in fact in this book, is labeled the joy of the whole earth, glorious place. But in this particular moment of Israel's history, Jerusalem has been invaded by foreign armies and has been totally and utterly destroyed. And the level of suffering is huge and horrific. And this book, Lamentations, is the poet's, or the author of the book, is his attempt to process it with God. It begins like this: how lonely sits the city. That first word in our English Bibles, how, is the Hebrew word ech. I think you pronounce it a bit like that, ech. I'm no Hebrew scholar, but I looked it up just before I recorded this. Ech. We translate it as how. Most English Bibles translate it as how. It's a word though, which in its original language is an expression of deep sorrow. Think, if you like, of the old English word alas. We don't use that very often, but alas, it's a word that expresses sorrow and bitterness and sadness and confusion. And that's the word that this book begins with. It's also the word that chapter 2 begins with, and also chapter 4. And so the whole tone of this book is one of sorrow and bitterness. And as you read through it, you're going to discover that as well. And so the poet, I'm going to call the author of this book the poet. Think Jeremiah maybe, but I'm going to call them the poet. The poet is reflecting on all the pain that he himself has walked through, but the pain that his people and his nation are walking through. And, we have moments in life, don't we, where we walk through a lot of pain, emotional pain, physical suffering. But as you read through this book, there is another layer to this pain that makes it particularly difficult to process. Because not only is the poet trying to process physical and emotional suffering, he is also processing a theological crisis. Because he's looking at the situation before him and it is beginning to provoke questions, deep questions in his mind and his heart about who God is, about why God has allowed these things to happen, about the nature of suffering, about God's power. And you know, when we go through circumstances that are extremely painful, we can often begin to ask those questions of God as well, can't we? We can walk through stuff and it can begin to unsettle the things that we believe to be true about God. And that's what the poet is doing in this book. And as you read through this book, what you're going to discover is that you don't really get answers to these questions. You don't get answers to these deep, painful questions. Not in the way that I think we would hope. But what I think this book does do for us is it gives us permission to ask those questions without fear. I find it actually a great comfort that God included a book like this in the scriptures. You see, God's not oblivious to the human condition. He's not oblivious to the fragility of our hearts. He's not oblivious to the questions and the confusion that life often begins to provoke in us. And so God, by placing this book within the scriptures, I think he's giving us permission to ask deep questions, to ask hard questions, to ask painful questions. And I think that's a good place for us to start as we dive in to Lamentations. There is a commentary that I've been reading to help me understand the message of this book. I think it's written by a guy called Christopher Wright, and the subtitle to the commentary is this: Honest to God. That's his summary of the message of Lamentations, honest to God. And so let that be a way for us to begin our time in Lamentations. Let this book give you permission to be honest, not just with God, but to God. We're going to be back tomorrow and we're going to think about some of the things we read in chapter 2. But hopefully that's just been a little help as we dive into this book together. See you tomorrow.